St Michael's Mount, the rocky islet that dominates Mounts Bay in Cornwall. Many of us are familiar with its famous outline against the blue horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. But we might not have stopped to ask, what is the magic of the Mount? Is it perhaps the Mount's birth in myth and legend? Of the Cornish fishermen in the bay who saw an apparition here of the Archangel Michael in 495 AD, thus giving it its name and creating the place of pilgrimage. Up these steps throughout the Middle Ages came pilgrims from all over Europe to worship in the chapel of the monastery that had grown up on the windswept crown of the Mount. In 1135, Abbot Bernard of the daughter house of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy had rebuilt the church. But this, in its turn, was destroyed in an earthquake that racked Cornwall in 1275, only to be built anew again. Here, Benedictine monks sung their litanies for many centuries. And now it is the parish church of the island and the castle's chapel, still with St Michael as a guardian saint. The magic of the castle's even earlier myths enthrall children visiting the Mount. They are not spared the grisly tales that were once told only by the light of a fire after dark.
Hello children, gather around. I'm Uncle Jack, and I'm going to tell you the story of Jack the Giant Killer. Now many years ago, we had a giant here. He was called Camoran, and he terrorized the people. He stole their sheep, he stole their cows, he killed the people. So they got a young fella called Jack the Giant Killer. And Jack's idea of killing the giant, because he was a terrible man, was to dig a big pit. He dug it here, about 20 feet deep. Camoran was up the path, sleeping. So Jack took out his horn and he blew a mighty blast. It woke old Camoran, because that was the name of the giant, woke him up. He dashed down the hill. Now Jack ran around the pit, but the giant didn't know the pit was there, and he came down, stepped on the branches, and bang, down he went, and he was killed. So since then, we haven't been terrorized by any giants.
From the ever-watery well that created the Camoran myth, to the pathway to the castle, a cobblestone of which created the legend of the giant's heart, pickled in brine and shrunk hard as stone. And the steepness of the path causes everyone's heart to pound. Or is the magic of the Mount the fact that it is rooted in the sea, which governs all its activities? Not only storm and tempest, but the very tides themselves, their times calculated by a special clock in Sir John's room, are the centre of its life. The castle is truly an island at high tide. At the end of the causeway, which is open for just a few hours every day, is the watch house, for many a generation the hub of the Mount's maritime existence. Here the boatmen who ply the motor launches between Marazion and the Mount are now in radio contact, a far cry from the days of their lordships' oared ceremonial barge of 1740, one of the oldest vessels afloat anywhere. So when the causeway that was built in 1425 is deep under the water of high tide, the little island community still has to rely on its water transport. Yes, this is part of the magic, surely, the arrival by water. How many millions of visitors have thrilled through the ages to glimpse the castle and its harbour village from the arriving boat? It fulfills all expectations. An experience shared by the young Queen Victoria when she set foot here in 1846 with Prince Albert, her consort. Her first dainty footfall on the quay immortalised in brass. The magic of a place not only isolated on its rocky knoll, but built of the very granite it clings onto. A castle in the air, but also a castle that is solidly and defiantly built against its enemies. Not only people, but also the biting southwesterly gales. With its battlements and winding approach path, this is a castle unlike any other. But maybe the magic that is unlocked here is not just the stuff of romance, but the true facts of a long and daunting history. Here on its walls are displayed the weapons of its defenders. And here, deep in its rocky bowels, is the room where the castle's medieval garrison ate and slept, while the monks of the abbey dined in some splendour above. This is Sir Francis Bassett, whose brother Sir Arthur sold the mount to the St Alban family in 1659. That year marked the end of the mount's tempestuous military history and the castle's gradual conversion from fortress to home. But the preceding 100 years had witnessed many stirring events. The top of the tower has the remains of the medieval lantern used to guide ships away from the mount's rocks. But it was also the place where the beacon was lit in 1588 at the sighting of the Spanish Armada, the first beacon lit in England. The message flew to London in a blaze of light, and invasion was eventually averted. In the Civil War, half a century later, the castle, with its strong defences, saw action. Here is the gorge, up which Cromwell's men attempted to take the mount from a treacherous seaborne landing. Finally conceding defeat in Britain's last, but bloodiest civil war, Sir Arthur Bassett, captain of the Mount, surrendered the place on April the 23rd, 1646, and the royalist flag was hauled down. The new parliamentarian successor was Colonel St Alban, whose family arms now adorn the old guardroom. His oak chest as new captain of the Mount survives, carved with his name as befitted his new status. A dozen years in residence, and he was able to buy the Mount from the Bassets, whose loyalty to the king had been their downfall. How were they to know that the very year following the sale, the monarchy would be restored in England, by which time the St Albans had become ardent royalists, emblazoning the royal arms of King Charles II over the fireplace of the old monk's refectory, which survives with its original 15th century open roof as one of the Mount's finest interiors. In the exuberance of the Restoration period, the room was also embellished with a plaster frieze illustrating a hunt, causing the room to be named after Chevy Chase. Hunting was considered an appropriate theme for a dining room in those times. Whilst the Mount itself was at peace, its people fought in imperial and world wars. A helmet here that saved the life of Lord St Leven's father, and his brother's berry from the Battle of Arnhem, together with a dagger brought back by the gardener in 1945, souvenirs of a history that has not ended. But some say the magic of the Mount lies in its gardens. They are unique, like a gold or silver setting for a fine jewel. Hundreds of tons of soil were taken to the island in the late 19th century to create an idyllic landscape, a garden paradise. The gardens extended this old walled garden of the 18th century, and they are now a wonder in their own right. But although the Mount used to grow vegetables and had its own herd of Jersey cows, the gardens are really pleasure gardens, exotic subtropical species, and trees more reminiscent of Italy than Cornwall. Visitors from a cruise ship will leave the Mount in a daze, having been in seeming contact with the past. But for their hosts, Lord and Lady St Leven, who live here, and it was his father, the third Lord, who gave the Mount to the National Trust in 1954, living in the most romantic house in Britain is a reality. Over tea, they discuss their very full diaries, representing as they do both the Mount and Cornwall at many gatherings and for many good causes. as the cruise ship sails towards the distant horizon. Even working hand in hand with the National Trust, the realities of the Mount, of course, are of maintenance and income. A fairy tale it may look, but it is a house to run, only with more difficulties than we might encounter. The St Aubyn family has ever had its problems, some of them of their own making. The 5th Baronet, for example, nearly ruined the family by his gambling. The papers in his portrait look suspiciously like writs. He even had to hide from his creditors up a chimney. But it is in the library that his atmosphere lingers, a gaming table. Whilst elsewhere in the castle are preserved some of the gaming counters with which he gambled away his inheritance. But it had been the 4th Baronet who gave the Mount two of its most charming interiors. The drawing rooms, converted in about 1760 from the ruins of the Old Lady Chapel. Here the Georgian fads for both Gothic and Chinese tastes meld effortlessly, aided by furniture by the famous Thomas Chippendale. The Georgian work firmly established the Mount as a comfortable home. By 1877, however, the family had outgrown its quarters in the old monastery, and they added a massive but extraordinarily unobtrusive extension in enduring granite, designed by Piers St Aubyn, an architect member of the family. Visitors are shown the smoking room from these well-off Victorian days, when romance went hand in hand with a fortune large enough to enjoy the idea. And this century, the butler had time to carve the Mount in champagne corks. Cornwall was once dependent on tin for much of its living, and these tunnels linking the kitchens to the new wing were cut through the granite partly to alleviate a period of mining unemployment at the time. By the 20th century, one could say the Mount was perfect in every respect. To keep it in this perfection, it was gifted to the National Trust, so as to safeguard the future, that the island and castle could be preserved by the Trust, with its long experience of the conservation of places of historic interest, with sensitivity and good taste. Here at Sunday service in the church, one wonders, is the magic of the Mount in its completeness, that sense of rightness and harmony? We are in the past, we are in the present. The organist plays on an instrument first installed here in 1791. In a building as old as the castle of St Michael's Mount, each generation's additions have now made it the complete place it is today, with its harbour and estate village, with its own way of life and tradition, a vibrant community proud of its own work of conservation and local employment, keeping alive a most romantic and special place, now for the enjoyment of millions. This is the magic of St Michael's Mount.